It's November 26, 2012, and we are at one of the ICC buildings at 317 Elm Street to talk to Michael Gordon about his work with the ICC and in the Ironbound. So thank you.
Glad to be here.
Can we start just with a basic background question, where you're from, education, work experience, bring us up to date?
Sure. I was born in West Orange. Born in Newark Beth Israel Hospital, grew up in West Orange. Went to Mountain High School and college at Columbia College, Columbia University, where I was a political science major, always interested in the movement of people, how to organize people, goals and strategies for basically progressive issues. Then I went to law school, finished my law school at Rutgers in Newark, and was involved with a number of interesting classes and programs. One was the Constitutional Litigation Clinic, where we were preparing the amicus briefs for the New Jersey State University system in the Bakke case. In addition, I took a class with a Professor Arthur Kanoy, who was a famous professor at Rutgers, who was a famous civil rights lawyer. And when sitting in his class, it hit me that I wanted to take his strategy of working for certain communities and clients, and I wanted to apply it to the environmental field. And so that was my background, and after leaving Rutgers, I was fortunate enough to get a job at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection in the Division of Water Resources. I was a regulatory officer, that's what they called in-house attorneys at the time, and I was involved in major water pollution enforcement cases. While I was there, one of the jobs I had was to attend public hearings in communities that were impacted from hazardous waste that had either gotten into their wells or into their neighborhood. And I would always tell them to go seek legal counsel. And everyone would come up to the microphones and say, I talked to my private attorney, the attorney who did my will or did my closing or is my friend of the family. And they said they don't know what to do and how to begin and couldn't possibly consider handling this kind of a case. So that was about 1981, and I left the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection in 1982, and that's when I met the members of the Ironbound community.
Okay, so going back before we get to the Ironbound, why environmental issues?
You know, that's like asking somebody why they dance. I mean, that was my passion. As I grew, I knew I had a desire to be active politically, legally, and on an issue that meant a lot to me, the environment. I mean, sometimes I think it could be that when I was growing up in West Orange, from the moment I could remember, there was a threat of putting a major highway right across the street from us, Route 280, and kind of how that whole issue played out and ultimately got built. It might have had an impact on me. It could have been just everyone in New Jersey recognizing the urbanization, the loss of space, you know, the access to fresh water and fresh air beginning to diminish in the 70s, and so that could be why as well. But I was drawn to the environmental issue. Even at Columbia, I was one of the founding members of the Columbia Earth Coalition. It was time right after the Earth Day was introduced of kind of environmental consciousness reawakening. So that's a general reason.
Now, being from Rutgers myself, I can't help but ask, what was sort of the environment at Rutgers Law School when you were there? Was it known as a particularly activist or publicly oriented?
Oh yeah, it was totally a mecca for political activists and legal activists. At least that was my view and my crowd. The environmental program was just introduced while I was there, so I took really the first environmental class with Professor Latin, who I think is still there. He came there to begin teaching environmental law. And that in the Professor Kanoy's class, which was called People's Law, kind of combined those two. And I remember sitting in patents and copyrights with a friend I grew up with in West Orange, John Skarbnick, who went to law school with me as well. And he knew from the moment that he entered law school he was going to do tax. And to me, that was, that just was, you might as well just torture me. But for him, he had that passion. And he leaned over and he said, what am I planning on doing? And I told him environmental law, and he was not alone when he said, what's that? I didn't even know that existed, because it was really the early days of environmental regulation, protection, and, activism.
So the field of environmental law, late 70s, early 80s, is largely because there's now a federal apparatus, regulatory
That's right,
apparatus?
the federal apparatus, which began to force the states to, in order to take over the federal programs, develop the infrastructure. And then we had in the late 70s, New Jersey passed the Spill Compensation and Control Act, which was the first law in the nation really to deal with the discharge of hazardous substances, because we were the combination of an industrial state and an agricultural state, the Garden State, and the #1 petrochemical state for the year in the early 50s. Before it all moved to Louisiana and Texas, we were really kind of the combination of that was a powder keg for the discovery of a tremendous number of hazardous waste sites that had been abandoned, that started to impact communities. Large communities were losing the water, and our state law, the Spill Act, became the model for the Superfund law. Governor Florio, who was then Congressman Florio, introduced it in Congress based upon the state law, and he was very familiar with it because, being from South Jersey, that's where a lot of the problems were as far as losing water supplies for communities.
Okay. And so you mentioned it in passing before, but so what brought you to the Ironbound and to...
Well, I learned my trade in the DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, but I don't fancy myself a very bureaucratic person. I knew I wanted to leave after enough people came up and said there were no lawyers able to handle their cases. I got this idea, naive and young and kind of starry-eyed, that I was going to represent communities that were having these problems. I knew the law. I had the passion. What else could it take? But I would learn what it would take. And I was at a public hearing up in Montclair dealing with Montclair radium contamination, visiting some friends from DEP who were still employed at DEP even though I had left. And I met the Ironbound community group leaders there, just milling around, introduced myself, said I used to work at DEP. I'm in private practice now, and if you ever want to talk about any issues, just reach out to me. And the next morning I came into my office. There were 3 of them sitting in my office. I think it was Arnold Cohn, Bob Cartwright, and Madeline Hoffman.
And what did they want to talk about?
Well, they wanted to talk about a list of problems that they had that just was unbelievable. They were fighting, and they were in the middle of battle trying to stop a company called At-Sea Incineration from building a facility where they would truck in or by rail bring hazardous waste from around the East Coast to a facility to be built in Port Newark. Then it would be loaded on ships and taken out to the ocean and burned. The waste would be burned there. And the infrastructure to deliver this material wasn't in place, and they were really, really concerned that this would just grow and swallow the Ironbound. They also talked about a permit application that McKesson Enviro Systems had, where they had a facility that had exploded, blown up, and was destroyed. It was a hazardous waste treatment facility, and they were trying to rebuild, and they asked me if I could help with that. So those were the 2 first issues, and I started to get involved. Of course, the Ironbound community had no funds, and it was a perfect match because at the time I had no clients. So we started working together, and I got to know the group well, and the issues were fascinating and they were challenging, and the community was really at the cutting edge of a lot of environmental issues. While I began working on those issues, they had a huge problem developed called the Thomas Street Warehouse, and that was about 10,000 hazardous waste drums were stored in a warehouse next to a grade school, and a fire occurred. And DEP came running in and said to the owner of the building, get rid of the drums, because if there's another fire with these leaking drums, it could be an explosion that would take the grade school out with it. Well, the landlord didn't have the money. The landlord said, I asked my insurance company and they're not paying for it. So it sat. And after a few months, I developed a legal strategy along with, we had a public advocate at that time who had an Office of Public Interest Advocacy, and together with the public advocate and the Ironbound Committee Against Toxic Waste, we made an application to the court for the first time to force the DEP, where I used to work, to use their own money that they did have available from this spill fund to perform the cleanup because of the threat of fire and explosion that could take out the grade school. And the judge issued the order requiring DEP to take control of the site to perform the cleanup to guarantee the safety. So that was kind of the first major victory, and it cemented, my relationship with the Ironbound community. They became kind of the flagship community of environmental activists throughout New Jersey, and they began to put together just communities around the state based upon our strategy, which was to use their community organizing skills and their activist skills, my legal talent, and we introduced scientific talent as well. We retained our own experts so that we could compete with either industry or with the government in understanding what the threats were we were facing. And that was 1982-83. And soon after that, we were victorious in the McKesson Environmental Systems permit issue. They weren't going to be able to rebuild. ATSI Incineration faded their application. They realized we were organized. And so in 1983, in June 1983, they discovered dioxin at the former Diamond Shamrock Agent Orange manufacturing facility in the Ironbound. And the community turned to me and asked me to lead up a group of volunteers to help them deal with that problem.
So with each of these, many of them successful legal strategies, I mean, what is the basis of those legal strategies? And for example, that the state would have a responsibility at some point to clean up the Thomas Street site. Was that a strategy that was particular to that time? In other words, it wouldn't have worked 20 years ago or 10 years ago, that there was something new in place?
There were a series of laws that were introduced, but it was it was the beginning of an understanding by attorneys representing communities. So we were the first, so I feel very good about the fact that we developed that strategy. There's a series of laws that built on old, what are called common law principles about protecting one's property, but that was a school, so that wasn't our property. But there was a law introduced in New Jersey called the Environmental Rights Act. And the Environmental Rights Act is a private attorney's general statute which allows any citizen in the state to enforce the environmental laws if they are not being fully enforced. So we utilize that to compel the Department of Environmental Protection to perform the job that they were supposed to be performing, which is to make the school safe. On the McKesson Envirosystems, that was a separate issue. There was a separate law called the Hazardous Waste Siting Act. And what we did, because we were trying to learn from our mistakes as a state, we said that no new hazardous waste facility could be put in a dangerous location, like a floodplain. And here we're sitting right after Superstorm Sandy, and you can just imagine, we know there are huge problems along the port. If there was a hazardous waste facility that had huge amounts of material on site during that storm and it got flooded out, that would be an added problem. So a new one couldn't be built in a floodplain. McKesson was arguing they were a pre-existing facility because they did exist in a location which would have grandfathered in. But I argued that they had blown up and they lost their grandfather status. And the Hazardous Waste Facility Siting Commission agreed with that argument.
Okay. And so, were you involved sort of only in the sort of legal maneuverings, or did you join marches and protests?
No, I spent a tremendous amount of time. My mother grew up in the Ironbound, so it was like being home. I marched with Nancy and Arnold and Madeline and Bob Cartwright, and we had hundreds of people in June, and we would organize the community. I would give speeches from the back of trucks. We had all types of activities to promote the awareness and to let the powers that be know that the community was organized, the community was solid in the support of the legal strategy, and it really, as I said, became a three kind of pronged approach, which is to have accurate information about what are the real threats, to have a legal strategy, and to be led by the local community and the activists who were community organizers. So I guess my next job will be president because, like our current president, I'm just a community organizing lawyer. That's really basically my roots. And it took off with my relationship with the Ironbound, and through that relationship, which lasted and still exists till today, I've represented probably 25 municipalities, 25 environmental groups, and the state of New Jersey in litigation as special counsel for environmental issues, all kind of based upon that experience. So it really was a life-changing and career-defining relationship. So it's really, I think, representative of when you hear the saying, whatever you give, you receive back multiple times. That's my relationship with the Ironbound. I really did not stop to think about how was I going to be paid. I didn't have a family at the time. I was single. I needed very little. But it was really an exciting time, challenging times. And, we had an excellent relationship. I think they trusted me. A lot of community activists at that time didn't trust lawyers. So I think understood their strategies, and it worked well together.
Wait one sec.
Musical interlude.
That's right. Are we good? Okay. So you mentioned how there wasn't a lot of money involved in this career-wise at the beginning, but yet getting scientific experts and mobilizing people, it sounds like an expensive proposition.
Well, different cases use different strategy. The Enviro Systems, the McKesson, that was purely legal work. The Thomas Street Warehouse, that's one of the reasons why we teamed up with the Office of Public Interest Advocacy at the Public Advocate's Office, because we needed some expert backup, and they were able to help us secure that. In the dioxin litigation, after they discovered the dioxin at 80 Lister Avenue, I was able to secure co-counsel, who was a famous trial lawyer who had a lot of funds, who was willing to support our effort to get the best scientific information available and paid for. So each case, you need to develop a strategy based on what you are able to do and need to do. I mean, I also was the attorney for I call it my one great defeat for the Ironbound, which was the Ironbound battle against the garbage incinerator, and which again was leader of a statewide effort to get a sane solid waste policy for the state of New Jersey. And the original vision was to have a garbage incinerator in every county. The Ironbound, again, was at the point of organizing the information, and we ultimately convinced the state that the strategy was misguided, but they built the incinerator here. We had told them that if they build it here, it's inconsistent with recycling goals that the state of New Jersey already had, that it will end up being a private disposal place for New York City's waste, which it has become. Camden has one, Warren County has one, but there are about 15 less garbage incinerators in New Jersey because of the efforts of the Ironbound community on solid waste issues. So we really pushed the solid waste issues. Because of my affiliation with them and the litigation work I did, I was on Governor Florio's emergency solid waste task force, which kind of reassessed our whole statewide strategy and came out and made us the #1 recycling state at the time. So we've done a lot of different excellent work together.
So not a total defeat.
Not a total defeat. You know, although my kids will say every time I go by that incinerator, I'm banned from using those words, and you know, now they're in their 20s, so they still laugh because it just gets me every time. There's just, you know.
So, I mean, I've always wondered because, you know, I know there was sort of a string of incinerator and other waste disposal proposals
Yes.
for the Ironbound, you know, throughout the 80s and probably to today, and many of them defeated. But what was the difference with that one?
Money and power were lined up. The Port Authority backed it. There were incredible powers that wanted to see that done. It was part of a multi-billion-dollar strategy in the early 80s. If you think about that now, that's like saying somebody's got a strategy worth a few $100 billion that this was the leading edge. This was where the battle was. Through the Ironbound Group, I ended up representing the borough of Richfield, and they fought the Bergen County Utility Authority proposal, which was to fill in wetlands to build a garbage incinerator, even though they could condemn property anywhere in the county for use of it. But the desire to build these plants, because there were so many people invested in the sums of money for the siting, the engineering, the operations, it was an enormous challenge, and the Ironbound led the fight. They, through an offshoot group called GRIO, Grassroots Environmental Organizations, they organized communities around the state, and Ironbound was also one of the first groups to reach out to South Jersey and to let them know that there were certain stories being told about what was permitted in North Jersey to the South Jersey people to try and allow them to have facilities in. And when everybody cross-checked the facts, it was found that there was a little misrepresenting going on about what the status was in North and South Jersey. So having a statewide community organization really was helpful. So.
And you've been involved in campaigns since the 80s in the Ironbound too, correct?
Yeah, I have been involved. The dioxin case lasted into the 90s. I was involved as the community lawyer. I represented former workers at the plant site. I represented neighbors who sought compensation. Now I'm special counsel to the state of New Jersey, trying to get the river cleaned up, focusing on the dioxin and other chemicals that came from 80 Lister Avenue. So since 1983, in one form or another, I've been involved in that litigation, in that series of issues that continue about what are we doing with that legacy.
And what is the status of the site and the river? And
the site has an interim remedy. So it's basically a tomb, a dioxin tomb, and it's to be revisited every 5 years. EPA is the lead, and they're really waiting for a cheaper disposal option. At the time of the proposal, what to do, it was told to the community that their options were to have the temporary tomb or an on-site incinerator. And because the garbage incinerator and other incineration problems associated with those operations, they chose not to go forward and submit in their comments to EPA support of that proposal. They said they'd rather it sit, be brought back, covered, it's monitored, but that's the status of the site. The river is a Superfund site, as is Newark Bay. It's under the direction of the EPA. The state has litigation trying to ensure that the cleanup goes forward under the direction and control of EPA, and that the citizens of the state of New Jersey don't have to pay, that those who polluted the river should pay for it.
Are there any, aside from the dioxin case, are there any other cases that you're involved with?
Because of my work for the state, which I've been doing for now the last 7 years, I'm not actively representing the Ironbound, because as special counsel, it's as if I'm a deputy attorney general. So I'm, right now, my allegiance, and you can see where the policies that the state does in their environmental enforcement, you can't be, even if it's a separate issue, really undermining those. So that's where my work is right now.
Got you. So we've talked to a couple other people about this this question, and sort of what your general sense is of the legal, or just broadly the sort of historical context for this sort of environmental work today compared to, say, when you were just starting out in the early 80s, or early to mid 80s.
Well, I think it goes through cycles. When we started our work together, the Ironbound community, my legal work, we really were in uncharted waters. The courts were very receptive because they recognized when we presented an argument, we were making sense, and that there really was not a whole infrastructure behind it at the state agencies, and that the companies had a poor track record. Now you're talking 30 years later, and there's a lot more experience. So when someone comes in with a similar case with a similar goal for a citizens group, they have to deal with a lot more history, and the agencies are a lot more experienced, and the regulatory system is a lot further defined. So that's a big change. I don't know if that's too technical, but through the experience, it's not, as my own view, not as easy as it was then, because now there are systems, and the courts tend to defer to the environmental agencies if there is a system in place to deal with a problem. And they were just developing the systems, and they really weren't mature enough, so the courts were more active.
That's interesting. I was going to follow up with, so is that good in your view, or is that bad? 'Cause it sounds like more experience would be...
It's mixed. It depends on the particular issue. And that's the other thing that, just in law in general, because I've done a lot of cases outside of the Ironbound, each case has its own kind of storyline and timeline, and it's hard to predict. And you really have to just get in there and follow it and see what the ultimate conclusion is.
Okay. Well, that seems like a good place to end for now.
All righty.
Thank you very much.
Really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you.